Usually when people go out to get their first AR-15, myself included, you're looking at something like this because you know it's got a lot of capability. But then you realize that this is actually very expensive. So more often than not, people end up with something more similar to what you see right here, which is a budget-friendly, cheap AR-15. And in this video, we're gonna talk about what this would be good enough for, what it might not be good enough for. We're gonna talk about some quality control issues that you should inspect if you're ever gonna buy an AR-15 at this budget tier level. And I'm gonna give you just my thoughts on the rifle's performance overall. So first and foremost, let's talk about the cost, because this rifle in total, as you see right here, was $558. Now it's an AR Stoner build out on an Aero Precision lower, and all the parts sourced for this rifle build can be found at Midway USA. And Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel, and thanks to them for helping with this project, because I wanted to get a budget-friendly rifle that I could test out and give my opinion and advice as to what new shooters should expect when it comes to buying a rifle at this price point. So big thanks to Midway USA. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the cost of the carry handle you see right here. Now this carry handle is an AR Stoner carry handle, and it was $60. Why does that matter? Well, a lot of these sub $500 AR-15s don't come with sights, so you're gonna have to buy either backup iron sights, or you're gonna have to buy a red dot sight, or some sort of sighting system for you to be able to even use the rifle. And so adding this $60 carry handle, considering the upper came with the front sight post, allows me to get this thing going as quickly and as affordably as possible. So that's what helped keep the price down to $558. Now, that price is from earlier this year, because I've had this for a while and I've been testing it just to see how it does so I can formulate a better opinion. So it might be a little bit more expensive now, but we're going off of what it cost when I purchased it. So the M4 223 Wild Complete Upper from AR Stoner was $290. And this has a 1-in-8 twist 4150 CMV barrel. So totally serviceable barrel, 16 inches, and a carbine length gas system with the front sight base right up here. And it's a very standard issue 2-piece handguard M forgery style upper. So totally acceptable, at least in my opinion. And one thing I will say is that when it comes to these budget friendly ARs, I usually look for something like this when it comes to the upper, because the front sight base is a little bit more reliable or robust than some of those cheap, low-profile gas blocks, and the way that they're set with set screws and everything else. It just usually doesn't have the QC for those to be as quality, whereas this tends to be a little bit more bulletproof. So I like front sight posts on cheaper builds, and I also like 2-piece handguards because you don't have to worry about some cheap rail you're gonna just throw away and change out anyway. So that's why I like this upper, in all honesty, and it's a 223 Wild, which means you can shoot 5.56 NATO or 223, and basically it's just optimized for both of those cartridges to be used in this rifle. A2 flash hider, totally serviceable as well. So pretty much a good to go upper, at least in my opinion, and it came with the bolt carrier group and the charging handle at that price. Now, we have a stainless steel AR Stoner magazine, and honestly, it's been good. I haven't had any issues with it, but I just wanted to have the complete rifle, so the magazine is included in the cost. And we also have the stock assembly you see on the back here at the receiver extension. And this came with the buffer tube, buffer, the spring, the stock, everything. And it was $60, so not bad at all, or $50, sorry. And then the lower parts kit was $60. And the lower parts kit is just a mil-spec AR Stoner lower parts kit, nothing special. Now the Aero Precision lower was on sale for $83 at the time. And even if it wasn't on sale, I like to splurge a little bit for Aero Precision lowers because I think that they're of a certain quality. So that's how we get to the total cost of $558. Now, these will be the very first shots from the budget AR Stoner 5.56 build. So the old M forgery. I'm zeroing it at 25 yards right now. And let's just see how it starts to function. Literally the very first shot I'll ever have put through this rifle. 5 rounds down, hopefully a lot more to go, but let's go see where I got it zeroed. And at least you got to see the very first shots out of this. There are some things I would suggest when putting together a rifle that's this inexpensive. We already talked about the front sight block or the front sight base. We also talked about the 2-piece handguard being a benefit. One other thing I would say is that I would prefer to get a complete upper receiver, just because When it comes to really inexpensive components and parts, sometimes it's just easier to have things that are assembled at the factory and have that whole thing be warranted to a degree to make sure that if everything is in spec, you're good to go. But if it's not, somebody's there to stand behind it. So I actually prefer a complete upper receiver when it comes to a really inexpensive build, but that's up to you to decide if that's important to you or not. And then the lower, I think, is worth spending a little bit of money on too. Get a quality lower so you can avoid any out of spec situations that you sometimes get with the less expensive lowers. And it allows you to avoid any burrs or anything like that when you're trying to seat some of your pins. It just makes for a much easier build process. So that's my 2 cents, and that's the total cost of this rifle. Now, let's get into the quality control issues so I can show you some of those directly in order for you to inspect your own rifle with if you ever find yourself with something of this quality. And then we'll discuss the use case scenarios, what this is good enough for, what I think it might not be good enough for, and what I could actually do to this rifle to make it a little bit better. Here's the complete lower receiver, and it was built out with an AR Stoner lower parts kit, which also included the pistol grip, as well as an AR Stoner receiver extension kit, which had the stock. So everything here is AR Stoner except for the lower itself, which is an Aero Precision. And the reason I go with Aero Precision over saving some money on like an Anderson or something like that is just because, in my opinion, the QC is just above and beyond, which means I don't have to worry about burrs or anything in any of the pinholes. I don't have to worry about things being out of spec, and it just generally seems to be a better quality receiver. So that's why I go with Aero Precision. But in general, nothing here is special. We have a mil-spec trigger, we have a mil-spec mag release, we have a standard carbine buffer with a standard carbine buffer spring. On this side, we have the standard mil-spec bolt catch and safety. This is not ambidextrous. Everything is just very plain Jane, but you know what? It works, it does the job, and this isn't really gonna have as much effect on reliability as the upper. So let's get into that and talk about some of the things you gotta watch out for regarding your upper. I did want to touch on one point of reliability on the lower that you can actually fix yourself very easily, and that's by staking your castle nut. So I did go ahead and do that just to make sure this doesn't come loose and cause problems over time. So staking your castle nut is an easy way to ensure that your lower is as reliable as it can be for the most part. And so I would definitely suggest doing that on a more budget-friendly AR. A major component of any AR-15 when it comes to reliability is going to be your bolt carrier group. So I pulled out a BCM bolt carrier group right here so that we could compare it to the AR Stoner one we got in our complete upper, and that way you can see the differences between a high quality reputable manufacturer versus what you get when you buy something that's more budget tier. One of the first things that's very obvious in the sense of inspecting these two bolt carrier groups is going to be the staking job on the gas key screws. So let me go ahead and show you that close up. You can see the BCM is on top and the AR Stoner is on the bottom. The staking job on these two screws is much more aggressive on the BCM than what you have on the AR Stoner, which means that these screws are less likely to back out and it'll give you more longevity as well as reliability. Another thing to keep in mind is that this screw is actually stripped from the factory, whereas neither one of these screws is even near being stripped. So these are all considerations to make when you're looking at some of these more budget-friendly bolt carrier groups and complete uppers. Now, another thing that is actually different is that the BCM here is magnetic particle inspected and high pressure tested. So that means it's gone through the QC in order to verify it's going to be able to handle rigorous abuse. Whereas this particular bolt carrier group is only magnetic particle inspected and not high pressure tested. Now, both of these bolt carrier groups weigh the same amount, which is good in the sense of assuming they're to spec and use a lot of the same materials, but we don't know all of the materials being used on this particular bolt carrier group. The BCM tells us exactly what this bolt is made out of. It's a Carpenter number 158 steel, which means it's military spec. Whereas on this bolt carrier group, it doesn't tell us anything about the steel, which should make you assume it's probably lesser quality, which is how you get the price point down so low. So this is what I'm seeing on the outside of these two bolt carrier groups in the sense of the differences of quality. Let me go ahead and take them apart and we'll just see if there's anything different on the inside of these two groups when it comes to the firing pin or anything else. And that way you can really understand where some of that savings is going to, especially in regards to the main component of reliability in your rifle. All right, so here's the two bolt carrier groups fully torn apart. Now, one thing I will say is that this bolt from the AR Stoner is actually made out of 9310 steel, which is labeled right here, and I just couldn't see that before until I disassembled it. But what's nice about that is that that's totally acceptable steel for this job. It's just not Carpenter number 158, which is military spec, but my understanding is that 9310 is actually slightly harder than Carpenter number 158, so this is still plenty good steel for doing the job at hand. So that's definitely a good thing. And then we also have the firing pins pulled pull down and everything else, and it all looks identical. There's really no difference between these two firing pins or anything along those lines. Everything looks to spec and appropriate for what it's supposed to do. But I will say on the bolt faces, so the one right here on the right is the AR Stoner, and the one here on the left is the BCM. You can just see that even the extractors and everything else are pretty much identical. So it looks good to go in that regard. No issues there or no complaints when it comes to stripping these down just to verify that everything on the inside of this bolt carrier group is good to go. But those minor quality control differences I already discussed can lead to other issues in the future, and that's something to keep in mind. Now, let's move on to some other quality control issues I found on this upper that could be problematic. All right, so let's discuss some other QC issues you might want to inspect for on your budget-friendly AR-15 upper like this one. And the first thing I want to actually point to is the gas system, because obviously that can create reliability issues, and it's one of the reasons why I suggest the front sight base style of gas system on a budget-friendly upper instead of a low-profile gas block or something like that, because there's no set screws, there's usually not as many alignment issues, and these are a little bit more idiot-proof. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as you can see, the front sight base here is actually pinned to the barrel, which means there's generally going to be less issues with any type of seal or anything like that regarding your gas system and your gas port. And it's also not going anywhere. So it's a lot more durable and it's more likely to last. But one of the issues you can find regarding QC here is how the taper pins were inserted into the front sight base in order to pin it to the barrel. And you can see here that the machining on these pins is just not very well done. We have this particular pin over here is at too far of a depth. This one is decent, but the machining around it is pretty ugly. And then on this side, you can see that that pin that was at too far of a depth on the other side is now protruding on this side. And then over here, we have some more ugly machining with some burrs and stuff like that going on. So is it acceptable? I mean, this thing works perfectly fine. I haven't had any gas issues at all with it, but I will say that this is some of the QC that you're lacking when you buy from a more affordable manufacturer versus something you'll get from a more reputable manufacturer. Now, other things to keep in mind that I will say positive about this upper is that we actually have T marks on the Picatinny rail, which I find to be beneficial. It also is just marked M4 on the front of it, which I thought was kind of neat. But then another thing to keep in mind is that the feed ramps are actually aligned properly. Now in this upper, they're good to go, but that's something you would want to inspect because sometimes the feed ramps might not be properly aligned, which means the barrel extension might not be properly aligned with the upper receiver, and that could cause a lot of issues. So always check that out, but these M4 feed ramps are actually good to go. So in general, everything's fine here, and one of the reasons why I avoid any type of M-lock or more modern rail system on these budget-friendly uppers is because that can cause a lot of problems too when it comes to alignment, when it comes to the quality of the rail, when it comes to whether or not it's going to be able to hold a zero on any type of laser aiming module or anything like that. The rails you get on these budget-friendly uppers are generally just not good, and you're going to end up replacing it, and then you just spend a lot more money, which could have been spent on a better quality upper to begin with. So that's why I stick with these two-piece handguards, because it's one less QC issue I really have to worry about. This is kind of idiot-proof as well, and it just does the basic job of allowing you to put your hands on the gun. So let's go ahead and just talk about how I feel about this build overall, and then maybe some ideas about modernizing it here in the future. All right, now that you know about some of the QC issues, let's talk about my thoughts on this rifle. What's it good enough for? Well, it's good enough for training. You can definitely get out and start training for $560, which is actually really good because honestly, that's much better than not having a rifle at all to train with. And this can get you on the range and started with learning fundamentals and muscle memory and everything else that's required to be proficient with a platform like this. So it's definitely good enough for that. Now, it's also good enough in the sense of being like a utility gun. What I mean by that is maybe like a truck gun or something that you don't plan on using in a serious measure, but something that you might need occasionally, maybe around the property or maybe, like I said, in your vehicle. So it can definitely fulfill that role too. Now, I would say it's probably good enough to arm someone else with as well, aka somebody who isn't necessarily into firearms, but as part of your group or part of your mag, and you just want to make sure that everyone is armed in some way, shape, or form, then this can definitely fulfill that role without breaking the bank. Not that that should be your job, but we should anticipate people to be unarmed to some degree that might need our help. Whether or not that's our close friends who are usually armed and might be separated from their equipment, who knows what the situation is, but that is a possibility, and this could fulfill that role as well. Now, what's it not good enough for? Well, I wouldn't necessarily trust my life to this rifle. And what I mean by that is it's definitely not good enough for a long-term SHTF scenario. Why? Because there's a lot of QC and material issues that could easily come up during a long-term situation where you might not have access to parts, or you might be in an austere environment where things are getting dirty and gummed up and just not working as well as they usually should. So that's a consideration to make. And honestly, I've just had quite a few malfunctions with this rifle, and it's expected because it's a $560 rifle. Like, you don't expect this thing to work flawlessly 100% of the time at that price point. You're paying for lesser quality components and lesser quality materials, and you have to expect those types of results. So I have had issues like double feeds. I've had issues like failures to eject, and yes, everything's lubricated and cleaned and, taken care of properly, but it just kind of goes to show that at this price point, some of those malfunctions are expected, right? Now, of course, those can be remedied pretty easily. And so you can eventually upgrade this to the point where you're not having those malfunctions, but it's just something I would expect from a rifle of this tier. Now, is this rifle better than no rifle at all? 1000%. You can get out on the range and start learning how to use this properly at this price point. And honestly, the malfunctions that come inherently with it are good for training tools because it teaches you how to clear malfunctions or how to get that reload in that you weren't expecting. So it does provide some of that at least. But in all reality, I just don't think this is quite good enough for betting my life on. But if it's the only rifle I had, because I have this currently so I can get out on the range and train with, and it's a placeholder as I work my way up towards something better, or if I work my way towards better components for this rifle, which is definitely a viable option, well, it's still a lot better than no rifle at all. So, listen, it's good enough for training, and it's good enough for utility, but I wouldn't bet my life on this rifle. That's just my experience. It has had some issues that were expected at this price point, but in general, it's run pretty well, especially in the sense of the gas system and especially in the sense of it just being good on the range. So let me know your thoughts down below. What is your expectation of a $560 rifle? What's your experience been with budget rifles? We've all had a budget rifle that just runs flawlessly for a certain amount of time. But just like this rifle, the components and the materials are not as high of quality as they could be, which means, over a long-term duration, they're more likely to fail than other quality components and materials would. So that's why I think this still has a place. I think it's got good value in the sense of what it can get you started with, but I do think that you should set your sights on something of higher quality if you take your preparedness and the ability to defend yourself, your family, your community, and possibly your country to heart. You have to actually understand what you're investing in when it comes to that. And if you're talking about a life-saving tool like an AR-15, I want one that's gonna be of a certain level of quality that I know I can depend on. And this gun isn't necessarily of that quality, but I don't expect it to be at $560 either. So make your expectations realistic and understand exactly what it is you're getting into when it comes to some of these lower quality, budget-friendly AR-15s. Is there something wrong with it? No, I don't think so. It's just like anything else that's less expensive. It's going to have to compromise somewhere. And this one just compromised on some reliability, which I would think 100% is the most obvious thing that you're going to lose out on when it comes to rifles of this price point. So let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are. Let me know if you want any other information regarding this particular rifle. I think it's good to have, and I'm still going to hang on to it. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, but I think I'm probably going to do a modernization project on it, and I'll probably bring it a little bit higher in quality with some new components. So if you want to see that project in the future, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you hit the subscribe button so you'll be notified when that video comes out. But those are my thoughts. Anything else you need from me, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, it's going to be it for Magic Prepper.